To keep up with today's increasing production demands, growers are quickly realizing traditional fertilizers are coming up short. Beyond a single form of sulfur, Microessentials with fusion technology delivers sulfate and elemental sulfur for season-long availability. Early in the growing season, sulfate sulfur provides young plants the nutrition needed for optimal growth. But plants dependent on sulfate sulfur alone are left vulnerable to the yield-robbing impact of leaching. But Microessentials is very different. Over time, microbes in the soil more efficiently convert the elemental sulfur into sulfate, continuously supplying the crop throughout the entire season and beyond. Only Microessentials with fusion technology delivers season-long sulfur for steady nutrition throughout the growing cycle, resulting in higher yields and higher profitability.
home on our own operations. And so I'll introduce myself. I'm Megan Overby with the Red River Farm Network. On stage, I have Kara Hart as well. And then throughout the room, you heard Randy Coonan doing the market update. We have Don Wick in the back as well, and Jay Rader, who is part of our sales and marketing team. So the whole crew is here. And Kara, can we introduce our stage guests?
Sure thing. So our guest today will be closest to Megan, NDSU Extension Crops Marketing Economist, Frayne Olson. Many of you, I'm sure, know Frayne. And next to me, we have Bret Oelke of Innovus Agra. Thank you both for joining us. And to get us started, we know agriculture has had many, many shocks to the system this year. We've gone from one weather extreme to the next, as we all know, too wet to too dry. The country is also dealing with COVID, believe it or not, still. How does that change a farmer's thought process in management style right now in these times?
I'll start because...
Go ahead. Jump in. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll take the first stab at that. First of all, hopefully it creates a sharper focus on management. When things are easy, we don't have to make really difficult and challenging decisions. And when things become more difficult, then we're forced to become better at what we do. And that's especially true of managing any kind of a business, so that they have the opportunity to survive. And part of that includes having maybe a bit longer term vision than just what tasks I have to do in the immediate weeks or months. And I think that those growers, whether they're farmers or ranchers or feeders, that have a more fine-tuned management system in place will have a distinct advantage when we're into some of these more challenging situations.
True. So I guess one of the things I want to try and I've actually been thinking a lot about this and how to, from a management standpoint, how to deal with it. We have, in agriculture, in farm management, we have these traditional risks that we're comfortable with, that we understand, that we know. We're always going to have yield variability. We're always going to have uncertainty about what the markets are going to do and how to manage that. But then we have this other category of things that are these wild cards that we just don't see coming. And for a lot of years, we didn't have to worry about those, what some people call black swan events. Those odd things that happen. It's like, boy, I just never saw this coming, and I can't manage around it. When, again, yield variability, price variability, we have tools in our toolbox. We can probably refine some of those tools, as Bret was saying. We can become better at that. But we know we've got tools in our toolbox to manage that. The ones we don't have in our toolbox that are more reactive rather than proactive are these COVID, the trade war. Nobody really saw that coming. How do you adapt and how do you change those kinds of things? How do you think about those from a manager's perspective to become better at not only recognizing those early and trying to respond to it or adapt to it, but then what do we have in our toolbox to deal with that? And those kinds of events are much, much more difficult. Those are again, as I said, more responsive. We try to identify what's going on and we have to respond to it. A lot of risk management for those traditional risks, yield risk, price risk, uncertainty about production costs, etc. Those we can put a plan together and a strategy ahead of time. So a lot of risk management is you can't, after the fact, you can't catch up. I don't know if I had $1 for every time he's saying, farmer would call me and say, well, gee, I know I should have sold at, but I didn't, so now what do I do? We're already playing catch up. Yeah. The whole thing with most of the risk management strategies, you got to put them in place ahead of the time rather than to be reactive. Unfortunately, we do have these events where you have to be reactive, responsive. Mm-hmm. And those become a lot more challenging because they're typically new events, things we've never seen before. We're all struggling with thinking, well, what do we do here? I've never done this before. And those become a great big challenge.
What do you think that farmers did well in their adapting, and what do you think that we still have to learn as we move forward?
So I'll talk specifically from a marketing standpoint, but I think it applies to other farm management decisions. I jokingly say there's only two emotions in marketing, greed and fear, right? And we jump from greed to fear in about a split second, depending upon what's going on in the marketplace. When things are going higher, we say, oh yeah, it's going to keep going higher, I need to hit that high. And when it turns on us, we get into the fear mode. It's like, oh crap, I missed it. So now what do? I think one of the things we've learned and hopefully become better at practicing is to change the question and say, is this good enough? Okay, we're seeing a rally, we're seeing things turn positive. At what point do you say, you know what, the risk-reward trade-off is such that I'd rather make a decision and lock something in right now rather than risk the downside. We're constantly looking at those opportunities saying, well, it could go higher, it could go higher. We don't always ask the question, well, what would happen if it went lower? And so hopefully, knock on wood, hopefully we're becoming better at balancing this. What are the risks? What are the potential rewards for it? Risks being the downside, the adverse events, those things that kind of hurt us financially.
Bret?
So I just hope we become better at recognizing opportunities and taking advantage of those opportunities.
I think we've got a situation where we've had some growers, some farmers, some ranchers adapt a lot faster and a lot better than others. And that has created, I think, some mental health issues with some of our folks. And even though this isn't the question you've asked, I think it's really important that that discussion take place and that other people recognize that, so that if someone does need some help, they can ask for it and not feel as if they're the only ones that are in that situation. Because there's a lot of financial duress out there right now because of the drought, because of decisions that were made a year or 2 years ago. It's not just, I didn't sell when it was high, it was I sold down here and then it went high.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a big part of that as well. And until people can get around the idea that when I made that selling decision, it was a good one.
Yep.
It doesn't matter that I didn't hold all of my grain or cattle or whatever it is
Right.
for this specific price target.
Yep. And we want to remind everybody too, we forgot to mention this at the beginning, but if you have a question at any point of the discussion, we have Randy in the back and Don as well and Jay that will be walking around with some microphones. So we want this to be a conversation with you guys as well. And if you don't want to ask the question yourself, they'll certainly ask it for you. And this is being live streamed as well. So if you want to go back and rewatch, and we welcome our visitors online too, you can certainly do so. So on that note, where we left off, so let's talk a little bit about some of those tools in the toolbox. Of course, we know going into this year, starting with a dry fall last year, it was dry this spring, which of course made it interesting when it came to getting that crop in the ground and some of those decisions that were made. Now we're seeing those bushels or stock, whatever we're talking about, either come home or the bushels go in the bin or to the elevator. So what are some strategies that we can implement once we get a handle on production? Let's talk crops specifically.
Jump in. Go ahead.
Okay,
You can start. I'll try and follow up.
Well, again, it gets back to the discussions that we've had pre-harvest with the growers have been, what do we do with the crop that we expect to have post-harvest that, is average to maybe slightly below average and in some cases above average, versus the growers that are in the areas that are more drought stressed. What are we going to do if we can't make delivery on some of these HTA contracts or these cash contracts? And quite frankly, we've been pretty proactive about that. And over the last week or 10 days, as market prices have relaxed, we've had a lot of growers that we discouraged them from setting the basis on HTA or hedge to arrive contracts so that they had the ability to get out of them. Because there is a buyout clause on the back of those, and it's a lot easier to get out of one of those than it is a cash or cash forward contract. So as these prices have relaxed, people have been able to get out of those HTA contracts at little to no loss, or maybe a slight loss, so that they take at least that bit of pressure off the table. Otherwise, we're near our seasonal lows in futures for corn and soybeans, and wheat's always an interesting crop. I've been coming to Big Iron since I moved up into this area in 1994, and it seems like we've always had a little bit of a price recovery from our seasonal lows in wheat about Big Iron time, and then we kind of drift a little bit higher till we get to that mythical deer hunting high, right? Around the first part of November, and then the market can do whatever the market does. Generally, it goes down. Now, that may not be the case this year, particularly in spring wheat, but we've got these seasonal price patterns that normally occur both in futures and basis, and interestingly, we've got the best basis that I can ever recall having at harvest time on our grains.
Yep.
I had growers this week that locked in harvest time delivery basis in the teens on both corn and soybeans. And if you'd have had some soybeans available today or tomorrow or maybe Friday at a particular elevator not too far from here, you could have got a zero basis. Now, that's unheard of at or near harvest time. Yeah. So that becomes a part of that equation as well. We've got limited carry. Okay, we've got 8 cents going out to March, only 14 going out to July on corn. Soybeans have at least gone from inverted to flat or a little bit of carry, but we don't have the normal carry that we normally have, and we got really good basis. So that's going to create a little bit different set of marketing strategies that I'm going to let Lane talk about here now, because it's different than we would normally expect to deal with.
Yep, and again, to kind of springboard off of that, the way I think about this, Megan, is kind of in two pieces, and just to get your mind wrapped around what are the strategies. We have what's now the old crop strategy, the crop that's either in the field, soon to be harvested, or the one that we've got in the bin. Yep. What do we do with that? That's unpriced bushels moving forward. Yep. And then the next question, which actually I'm getting quite often, is so what do we do in 2022? What are some strategies, some things thinking about 2022, looking forward? Because you can't go backwards and change what you've already done. So let's deal with what we have, and moving forward, how do you adapt? You're absolutely right, Bret. I think this year is going to be an unusual year for a couple of reasons. Obviously, the spring wheat market specifically has a very unique set of characteristics that we normally don't see this time of year. But because of some of the issues with Hurricane Ida and some of the delivery issues now going on in the Gulf of Mexico and the New Orleans ports, the cash market is really trying to figure out how do we work around these delivery delays and some of the issues that we're seeing down at the ports, which indirectly is helping us, because one of the alternative shipping mechanisms is to try and divert some of those bushels out of the Louisiana Gulf and into the PNW and try and deliver through the PNW, which now means we've got to pull more grain into the PNW that normally doesn't travel that direction. We're having to try and pull some corn and beans from eastern part of South Dakota, the eastern part of Nebraska, that we normally traditionally don't have to pull. Thus, the reason for the really strong basis levels. Not only we have local supply-demand conditions, but we're trying to pull more grain to fill these orders. Not only short-term in the next couple of weeks, but actually some of the delays, the last I heard, at least kind of rumblings in the marketplace, was some of those elevators in the port facilities may be down for 6 to 8 months. Yeah. Now, they're gearing back up, they're making corrections, we're getting some flow through those ports, but it's still going to be slow to recover. So what happens with market flows? How do we adjust these flows of grain? You're absolutely right. There's right now very little incentive for farmers. The market is telling you right now, the signals, there's very little incentive to store grain. Again, what you're saying, the carry in the market, those incentives in the futures market, to try to say, well, I'll pay you more in the future for storing it instead of delivering it today. Those carries, those incremental increases are pretty small. We really don't see a carry in the basis. No. We don't see, the basis levels are exceptionally high right now, and if you look at the elevator bids, those basis levels stay really strong into March of next year. So the market right now is signaling to local growers, there's really no incentive to store. Now, what would be your incentives to store? Why would you put grain in the bin and wait? Coming back to our risk question, well, but what would happen if there's a problem in South America?
Right.
What would happen if suddenly China comes in and buys a lot more grain from the U.S. than we expect? And so this comes back to that risk-reward trade-off. My question to you coming back is, well, the market's telling you one thing, you want to do something different, and that's fine. I have no problem with people wanting to store, but my question back is, well, is it worth the risk? Is that potential opportunity to say, oh, they might have a drought or a problem in South America, is that big enough and strong enough for you to gamble and take the risk that, well, yeah, it might go up, but if they have a big crop, because Brazil is expected to increase plantings for both corn and soybeans this year, if they do have a normal year, we're going to have a lot of grain back into the supply chain nationally or globally, which will then drive prices lower. Okay, so I'm just using that as an example, trying to tie in. Old crop, we have tools in our toolbox, the traditional ones we normally deal with, because we know how many bushels. Moving to 2022, new crop, that gets to be a lot harder. Not only what crops do you plant as part of what kind of a mix do you put together for your farm plan, but then from a pricing standpoint, what do you do? And as you mentioned earlier, if you're signing the tools we normally go to first, you know, my joke is when the combine breaks down, what's the first tool you grab? It's a crescent wrench or a hammer, right? You don't go for those specialized tools yet because you're going to try and fix it quick. I'm going to argue moving into 2022, we need to start pulling out some of those specialized tools that our standard toolbox may not work as well in today's environment. So what do I mean by that? We normally, the first tools we pull out of our toolbox are those cash-based contracts with the local elevator, the local ethanol plant, the local processor. And they are great, they're fantastic, but they require delivery. They're expecting you the physical delivery of the grain, and if you don't have those physical bushels, now we have a problem. And I know there's a lot of farmers that talk to me this summer, say, boy, I know the price is really good, this might be the highs of the year, but I don't know how many bushels I'm going to have. I said, well, that's fine, but let's take a time out. You don't have to sign a cash delivery contract, even if you're leaving the basis open, or if you do basis fixed with the futures open. Those cash delivery contracts require delivery. We need to look at and think about those pricing techniques that we have that are futures-based. Either a hedge by going directly into the futures, working with a broker and setting that up, or some kind of option strategies. Again, there's lots of different strategies available depending upon what we think is going to happen. The advantage of those futures-based or options-based strategies is you can get in and out of them very quickly, right? You can get into them anticipating, well, I think I'm going to have an average year. Well, by the time you get into the growing season or even into planting, if you realize, you know, I may not have all the bushels I think I'm going to have, you can flip that back as quickly as possible and you don't have the delivery requirements.
Yep.
So from a risk management perspective, one of the things you're looking for is flexibility. Is how do I put a plan together that's flexible and adaptable enough to be able to adjust really quickly when I see these weird things starting to happen. And moving towards those futures-based or options-based strategies rather than the cash market-based strategies, even though they're simpler to use. Yes, you don't have the margin calls, you don't have the brokerage fees, etc. There's more complexity to this, but it allows you a lot more flexibility. This is time to adapt. How quickly can you adapt to the changing conditions? And those kinds of strategies, I think, have some real potential as we move in, especially into 2022.
Frayne, with a lot of the farmers that I've talked to, yeah, that all sounds good, but how do I do that? I'm not comfortable. How do you make farmers comfortable doing something like that?
Okay, so the first thing is, well, obviously I'm with Extension, so we have some classes on that. We have opportunities to be able to learn. Do a little bit of self-promotion here. So there are opportunities to be able to learn that, but the simplest, the lowest cost, in my opinion, is to find a broker or a crop consultant, a marketing consultant that you're comfortable with or has a really good reputation in the area, start working with them, because they can help you through not only the mechanics and understanding what's going on, but also adapt that strategy to your unique characteristics. Every farm is a little bit different. You've got different cash flow needs, you have different debt service requirements, you have different cropping mixes as far as the blend of crops you're dealing with. Everybody has a little different storage capacity from a physical storage standpoint. So part of it is to understand how does this work. You know, extension can help with that. There's other opportunities. But the second part is, so how do I customize it? How do I put a plan together for me, not knowing all the nuances and special little weird things that can happen? Well, a lot of farmers will hire a crop consultant to help with weed management, pest management, because a lot of times they will be able to identify a problem long before it becomes a big problem. They'll recommend the right mix of herbicides or insecticides or fungicides to be able to treat that particular problem. And a lot of farmers don't have any qualms about doing that. Well, a grain marketing specialist is the same kind of thing. You're hiring services, you're hiring those expertise. They can obviously oftentimes recognize shifts and changes a lot more quickly than you would as being kind of a novice or a newcomer to the system. So think of that as kind of like an insurance policy, if we will. You're hiring a professional to make sure that as an insurance policy, you do it right and it works out the way you want it to.
There's one more layer to that, and that is making sure you have adequate financing.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Going into the use of those tools,
Yep.
because we've pushed that off onto our buyers
Yep.
with the over-the-counter contracts that they offer. So you need to have a lender that is participatory in this, and then of course anybody that's a part of your operation that isn't a need to know, and have enough understanding that if there's tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars of margin capital that's trotting out the door, that it's going to come back in a different way.
Yep.
So that's another part of that. Now, it's easy to talk about setting prices. It's a little bit more difficult to set profitable prices.
Yep.
And I think that's going to have to be our next area of discussion, because we have seen an incredible increase in some of our costs, primarily fertilizer costs, but we've got a farm in Iowa that is starting to do cash rental renewals. They rent the bulk of their ground, and most of their land is on 1 or 2 year cash rental contracts. And the first one came back with a $90 per acre increase from last year. And of course, that's based solely on what market prices have been, not what market prices are projected to be. And that becomes part of the challenge. The second part of the challenge is, now that the port in New Orleans has had trouble, we've shut down a major supplier of nitrogen fertilizer, and we've seen high nitrogen fertilizer prices go up even higher. And we started clear back in July gathering up our projected costs for next year. And I hate to tell you this, if you put together a comprehensive budget of all of your costs, we've seen growers go from the high 3s, low 4s in terms of corn cost of production, all the way up to above 450. And this is using trendline yields. This isn't using, you know, this is a realistic.
The funny numbers.
Yeah, this is a realistic budget. And I've actually had a couple of growers that are tickling that $5 break even. Now, the December contract for 2022, the high has been about $5.30. And I'm here to tell you that we can't assure you that we're going to have 15 to 20 under basis at harvest time next year. That normal basis is 50 to 70 or maybe even $1 under. So before you start making plans to sell a significant portion, regardless of the tools, you better go through and really understand what your costs are going to be. And you have to include everything. You don't get to leave out miscellaneous overhead. You don't get to leave out a lot of the numbers that people have a tendency to just kind of push off to the side and ignore, because it's going to be critical that we make good decisions in terms of marketing, and not only that, good decisions on what we're going to plant. And I think that's going to be the other challenge this year. If you have not locked down the price of nitrogen fertilizer, and you're planning on planting a whole bunch of corn and a whole bunch of spring wheat with high yields, you might want to rethink that. Or at least not make that investment with our current futures prices that are being offered, and put down your fall applied P&K, whatever you put in, but give yourself flexibility, because we need to know what it looks like before we roll planters. Are we still in this dry pattern that we've been in? What's the crop insurance price for corn versus soybeans versus spring wheat? What are my APHs? At what levels can I insure at? And then you can make those planting decisions. So I'm encouraging growers to leave as many flex acres as they can, that they can roll into other crops. You know, you've got a base amount of corn, a base amount of beans, a base amount of wheat, if you grow that you're going to grow. However, if you've got the ability to flex into a crop that might take dry weather better, or that might be insured at a higher level, and I know it's sacrilegious to talk about this publicly, right?
Right.
But a lot of our decisions are made around those kinds of things. You can make planting decisions based on what the insurance value of those crops are. Now, you still have to do a good job. You still have to try to grow the crop, and hopefully we've got some time before we're out here to have a little bit of at least lay the groundwork on irrigated stuff like we were talking about beforehand. But you know, I think we need to have flexibility in that decision-making process and know what your costs are going in, and then start hitting those better prices that may be offered, but make sure they're profitable before you make those decisions.
So Bret, you're talking about planting for next year, and I know that there are farmers that are obviously already thinking about that, I'm sure, for their farm business, trying to make the right decision here. This is a two-part question, and I hesitate to ask it like this, but I don't know a better way to do it. So what are you hearing in terms of interest this year? Are you thinking more soybean acres then for next year? And then you also mentioned to keep a few flex acres open. We know that up in this part of the country, we have an opportunity to grow very different kinds of crops. Are you saying that maybe next year could be a good time to continue to tap into those really specialty kind of crops that we can grow up here?
If the contracts are available, and if you have experience growing them. I mean, I think that's critical as well, because you're not just going to go out and pick a crop you've never raised before and have a great deal of success in year one. Okay, that's like picking up any new type of activity.
Right.
You're not an expert right away. But I think you're right. We do have a lot more flexibility here in the Northern Plains in terms of crops, and I think growers need to take a look at some of those crops that they haven't traditionally done. I would say today, if you look at new crop 22 corn versus soybean versus spring wheat prices, if we have the ability to grow high quality spring wheat at a reasonable amount of production, we're going to see probably a pretty significant increase in spring wheat prices. If you look at the price drop on the nearby contracts versus the new crop contracts, we dropped about $1.50 from the high on the nearbys, and we've dropped about 50 cents, and we've made up 20 of that on the new crop spring wheat contracts. So it's still not high enough for those of us with higher land costs in the South Valley to be super comfortable, but the reality is, if you can grow, and I don't want to pick a number because you've got intensive versus extensive management and all those kinds of things, but if you can grow reasonably high yields of spring wheat, and we can insure at and hedge at price levels that are above where we're at right now, I think we're going to see a significant increase in spring wheat acres. Now, that can change, but that's why we need that flex. And if I've got $4.80 D's futures and normal basis, that's $4.30 cash off the combine, and my break even is $4.50, how confident am I that I'm going to have opportunities later on to make that better? That's again why I want to see more flexibility in this. And quite frankly, soybean prices compared to corn and wheat are vastly undervalued based on potential supplies, with the wild card of South America in there.
With the wild card of South
Right.
America, yep. So a couple things to follow up. First, if there's ever a year, I know I'm going to get myself into trouble, but if there's ever a year to do soil testing, This is it.
No kidding.
I mean, if you've been testing certain fields over time, you're trying to worry about the testing cost, guys, this is going to be one of those years where managing fertility, knowing what you're dealing with, what's already in the soil, because of the dry conditions, there's going to be a lot of variation in existing fertilizer in the soil profile. And today, this is going to be one of those years. It will pay to soil test. Just do it. Okay. A lot of you are doing that already, so I'm preaching to the choir. To follow up on some of Bret's comments, right now today, my viewpoint, my opinion, I do think the spring wheat futures are not working hard enough yet to rebuild and buy enough acres to be able to rebuild some inventories.
Agreed.
I think the reason, my opinion, the reason that it is, the September 2022 contracts are not as high as what I think they should be to be competitive, is there is still this wait and see attitude. Exactly how big a crop are the Canadians going to have? How many bushel will the Canadian crop be? What is the quality profile? Before they start bidding really aggressively, say, oh my God, we got to rebuild some of our inventories. And my opinion is I think that opportunity will come for spring wheat, because again, you look at December corn, November soybeans, September spring wheat for 2022, and you quick do the math on, well, what makes sense right now? And in my opinion, I don't think wheat quite does it yet.
Not quite.
I think we will have to have an increase, my opinion, in spring wheat acres, not only in North Dakota, but also on the Canadian side. A lot of the Canadian marketing folks follow the Minneapolis futures as that base, that starting point. So I do think the spring wheat market is going to have to work harder to make sure that we have the acreage base we need to rebuild and feel comfortable. When will that occur? I don't know. How quickly will the new crop market recognize we need to be more aggressive? I'm not sure the timing of that.
Doesn't that kind of depend on how much unpriced production is still out there? I mean, I had a lot of growers that, they stopped marketing spring wheat when it looked like we were going to have a disaster. They had a better crop than they expected. Cash wheat was north of $9.
Yep.
They took it all to town.
Yeah,
and they didn't hold any back. So now, if we do start to go on that run, we've got very little to temper that increase, because we're not going to have farmers selling that's going to reward that market, because the great majority of that's gone.
I think there's two pieces to that. My assessment, I think there's two pieces to that. As we started getting the rally in spring wheat, the first thing that moved was old crop.
Yep.
We started cleaning out the bins, especially for some of that low protein stuff, because when the protein discounts disappeared, everybody said, hey, here's my chance. This is what I've been waiting for, right?
Yeah.
So I got early on many more questions about when do I sell my old crop wheat when we're starting to reach that $9 level than I did, well, when should I market some of my new crop wheat?
Yep.
So I do think a lot of the wheat that's moved through the system so far has been those old crop inventories. We emptied out the bins. I do think, my opinion is, the extra bushels that we surprisingly got, even though there may not be a lot of them, did end up in the bin. I think the conservative view was, I got to wait to see exactly how many bushels of spring wheat I have before I start making additional sales.
Yeah.
So I do think there's going to be some inventories, unpriced bushels that can be moved. The other part that the spring wheat market is trying to figure out is, we know we're going to have tight supplies. We know our inventories of old crop are pretty much gone. We know that the crop this year is going to be small. Prices have risen. Have high prices done enough to curb demand? We never run out of crops. It's a matter of how high do prices have to go before the buyers suddenly disappear and say, oh, I'm going to try something else, or it's just too expensive, I'm not going to do it. Mm-hmm. And typically the most price-sensitive group we deal with is the international markets. It's the international buyers. The domestic mills, they complain about it and they hate it, but they will pay up for what they need. It's the export market that's typically the most price-sensitive. And when we look at our big buyers of spring wheat this last year, number one has always been the Philippines. Last several years, Philippines has been our number one spring wheat customer. Number two, traditionally, has been Japan, and then this year, surprisingly, has been China. In 2021, this last marketing year, old crop, China came in and surprisingly bought quite a bit, very small bought purchases, but they bought quite a bit of spring wheat. Now, we have a whole bunch of countries kind of size-wise that are below that I do think will step away and say, you know, this is too expensive. Are the prices we're seeing right now, both old crop and new crop, is that enough to try and make sure that we have supplies going into harvest of next year? And I do think that's one of the reasons the spring wheat market, Minneapolis, is still kind of trying to decide that. It's this, do we have what bushels are from Canada, and have high prices done enough to try and minimize or decrease our demand base internationally? So I'm looking for kind of two things in the next couple months to give us a signal on, number one, what's our export sales pace, to say have the international buyers backed away, but then more importantly, what are those harvest reports coming out of Canada? So I do think the spring wheat market right now is taking a pause until we get that information.
And I would agree with that. And if you look at the classes of wheat, the white wheat situation is worse than the hard red spring.
By far.
And there's a couple of reasons for that. The bulk of that's grown in the Pacific Northwest, Montana, and West. And even though a fair amount of that crop is irrigated, it's irrigated with runoff water, and they got shut off early, which leads to the discussion that you and I were having prior to starting. What are the crop insurance implications if you have an irrigated crop insured and due to no decision on your own, you're unable to provide water to that crop? And we don't have the answer to that, and maybe there's somebody out here that does, or there's somebody that's going to be watching online that can help enlighten us on that. Because we did see in kind of central Minnesota in those shallow well irrigated acres where they were restricted on the amount of water that they could put on their crop. And we saw that in the Pacific Northwest where the runoff water wasn't available, and those irrigation districts said no more.
Right.
You don't get to put any more water down, which impacted both the wheat crops and the alfalfa crops, which primarily goes to export out there, but there's also fairly high domestic use on that, which is also part of our shortage of high-quality forages that we need.
So I do know part of the answer to that. There's a part that I'm not sure about. So the lack of irrigation water is an insurable loss. Okay, so crop insurance, if your irrigation district cuts you off, and it's a managed district, and they say you can't pump enough water, or you don't have the capacity to be able to pump the water fast enough, and you're only able to, let's say, irrigate half the field instead of the full field, that is an insurable loss under crop insurance. Okay. The part that I'm not sure about, which we talked a little bit before we coming on air, was, well, what happens if that is a government-owned water, not an irrigation district? And that I don't know. So if it's a conservation group or if it's a state organization that suddenly says, no, we can't do it, I'm not sure what the rules are on that one.
Well, and so switching gears a little bit here with the few minutes that we do have left, you bring up the topic of forage, Bret, and of course that leads to with the drought. We know that we've seen some serious cow herd liquidation numbers. And whether you're a rancher or not, we know that any shift in any sector of agriculture is kind of a domino effect. And so let's talk a little bit about that. Some strategies for ranchers that have had to make some tough decisions. And, how do they come back from what some of them have had to go through?
Well, I mean, and I'm a livestock guy primarily, and I have felt the pain of feeding $7 corn and $500 bean meal, and we don't even know what the price of alfalfa will be later on this winter, but it's going to be high. So our prices have responded to a certain degree, but there's a tremendous amount of downward pressure in cattle just because of the liquidation that's occurring. And I think a lot of it's going to be stage of career. If you're a nearing retirement cowman or woman and you don't have anybody coming in behind you, this may be the opportunity that you have not been looking for to not re-enter, because at some point in the future when we do have adequate feed supplies and people are trying to build back cow herds, those bred heifers or bred cows are going to bring a tremendous amount of money. and it's going to take a pretty significant investment to get back in. And we've seen that already in certain sectors where we've seen commercial ewes sell for $400 and $500 a head this fall because the lamb market has been really good. Even though feed prices are high, there's people willing to make that investment. So it's going to be a challenge to rebuild a cow herd that we're diminishing very rapidly right now, and I'm afraid we're going to see some of those players not re-enter into the marketplace.
Frayne, do you have anything additional to say? I know this is more Dr. Tim Petrie's
It
realm,
is.
but when you look at the balance sheet as a whole.
Right. So, I guess I look at this from kind of the feed side of the ledger because I'm more on the crops, and you're absolutely right. This is a Tim Petrie question. I try and defer to him. He's the expert. But from an aggregate standpoint, if you look at kind of the feed demand base that we have in the United States, some of this is also just a shifting of where the animals are at.
Right.
I mean, we're having the sales up here, but who's buying them and what's happening to those cows and those calves after the auction? Obviously, the calves will be retained. They're going to try and be added into the herd later on. Some of the cows may be culled and hit slaughter. But I really don't, there's a shifting in where the animals are, but I don't know that it's going to have a dramatic impact on total feed demand. I think there's enough numbers out there. The hog herd is obviously very stable. The poultry guys have just continually to kind of grow all the time. So if we look at corn utilization, soybean meal utilization, I really don't see major shifts in that demand base. So it is more of a kind of a localized problem in our region just because we've been hit so hard by the drought and the dry conditions.
Certainly.
So how about our audience? I wonder, do you all have any questions for our panel? Any drought-related things we haven't covered that you'd really like to ask these two specialists that we have with us today? We are nearing the end of our time, which is why I ask.
Yeah.
Oh, there's a question right here, I see. Randy's come in with a microphone.
I guess maybe the other end of the cattle spectrum, if you're someone who's up and coming trying to build your herd or maintain a young herd, do you see opportunities this winter for whether bred heifers or young pairs, young animals, if you're fortunate enough to have the feed and able to, a buying opportunity, I guess?
If you have access to feed, I think there'll be some buying opportunities on some of those bred heifers, and particularly brood cows that, maybe have a short shelf life on them, but if you can get a calf or two out of them and you've got adequate feed, you might be able to find some of those at a relatively reduced cost and be able to build your herd a little faster than you might normally have been able to do.
Yeah, well, I guess in the last couple minutes here of our time, I'd like to hear from both of you just a quick minute of some final thoughts in summary of our discussion today. What would you like to leave folks with?
Go ahead. Hopefully you use all the time.
Yeah, no, I assure you I won't. So a couple things, just to recap some of the, what Kara started with on, given these weird, strange events that we've never seen before. One of the premiums I think we're going to see, especially moving into 2022, is the ability to remain flexible, to be able to adjust, to change, to shift as you start to see some of the environment change. So yes, we need to do planning. You need to have a strategy in place. What frustrates me is that, I've met, unfortunately, too many farmers that kind of shoot from the hip. It's like, well, I'm just going to wait to see what happens, and then I'll make a decision. Well, sometimes you're forced to make a decision pretty quickly without thinking through what are all the possible implications for that. So if you can do a little bit of, well, what would happen if, or how would I respond to, ahead of time and think it through, at least you have a structure of a plan, if this were to happen. So that's the first part, is actually do some planning ahead of time and think about what are some scenarios that may occur that I'm worried about. What is it that keeps me awake at night that I can start putting a plan together and saying, if this were to happen, how would I adjust or accommodate? And then the second part is, again, as you're implementing this, try and remain as flexible as possible. Don't try and get yourself boxed into a corner just because you expect X, Y, or Z to happen. So I think the two things, there will be a premium this year on flexibility and being able to adapt, but also you're going to have to think this through because shooting from the hip is usually a bad idea.
Innovation comes from an area of discomfort. And I would encourage people to take the discomfort that we're experiencing now to sharpen your management and decision-making skills. And that's really what you've been saying.
Yep.
And that is, you have to have a plan, but the plan has to be flexible. Because there's so many moving parts, there's so many variables that we don't know at this point in time, that you have to have a process to make those decisions in place. You don't necessarily have to make the decision today. You just need to know how you're going to do it.
Right.
Being able to adapt, and those who adapt may be able to survive this, essentially. Thank you all so much for joining us. Let's give a round of applause for our awesome panelists today.
Thank you.
And thank you to our audience that are joining online and in person here at the Big Iron Farm Show. We're so glad that you're here. Again, we've been visiting with Innovus Agra's Bret Oelke and NDSU Extension's Frayne Olson. We appreciate you being here. Again, I'm Kara Hart along with Megan Overby on the Red River Farm Network, getting ready to wrap things up and hand over our microphones to Ag Country Farm Credit Services. So we would encourage you to stick around. Sounds like they're going to have a very interesting discussion next. But before you head out wherever you're going next, or if you are sticking around, don't forget we've got some awesome hats down here, and we also have a lineup. We've got a market discussion happening this afternoon too at 1:30. That's really great to tune into. Thank you for joining us today.